Thank you, Phil. It's good to be here. And that's my Kennedy impersonation. That's all there is to it. So good morning, everyone. Phil is absolutely right. This is going to be an exciting day. And if anybody knows how I do these things, I like to get everyone involved and interactive and discuss things sort of like an Oprah Winfrey type thing. I don't know nothing like Oprah Winfrey, but I'll be out there trying to get you involved in the conversation. So we had a great dinner and great discussion last night at my table. It was terrific. But walking back, I couldn't help but notice, I don't know if anybody else did, as you're going outside, because you walked up there and it was like the building was beautiful. And outside they had this round area that was sort of a mix of Stonehenge and just this round area, almost like a mini Coliseum. And I couldn't help but think of William Shatner in Star Trek. I was compelled to tear my shirt off and start fighting and doing something with that. Thankfully I didn't. I would have been escorted off the property, but that's a whole other story. I've probably done that before. So my name is Tim Scannell. I'm with the CIO Executive Council. I'm going to put this down before I spill it on myself. And I'm not going to get into all the details of what the council is. It's a global community of CIOs and IT leaders. And what we do is we create opportunities for them to get engaged, to talk to each other. We do a lot of roundtables. We have a lot of programs and services. We work with their IT staffs to give them educational services they're bringing up. We have diversity programs. We also are all about personal professional branding of these executives, so we get them into speaking engagements, we get them in the press, we've placed people in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and all that stuff. A lot of stuff behind the scenes, a very trusted community. In fact, right now we have an effort within the council to position the CIO, the upper level IT leader, and it doesn't necessarily have to have the CIO title. It could be a director, because CIO title outside the United States is not as strong as inside the United States. They're more like directors. But positioning that person as not only a technology officer, but a corporate officer. Technology plays such a vital role in the success or the failure of a business, the competitive edge that a business may have. One of our members, who is the CIO of SAIC, a huge system integrator that deals with the government, his IT budget is 1.5 times larger than the total corporate budget. If he makes $1 million mistake, the company gets hurt. He has that much power within the corporation. So I've been working with about 11 or 12 CIOs from a range of industries for 2 years, trying to define what we want to do with the CIO as corporate officer to position that person. They have a seat at the table. They don't necessarily have the respect and the power of other C-level members like the CFO, the CEO. They don't want to be the CEO. Someone else can make the decisions. But if the technology doesn't work to make that decision happen, then they should have the power to say, we have to hold off on this, or we can do it in 6 months. We can't do it now. So they have to be a corporate officer throughout the company, which was part of the effort. But I'm happy to explain more about that later. So if you think about the presentations yesterday, I was kind of thinking this is just like a SWOT analysis. We're talking about the strengths and the weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats of IoT, and you can base your decision on that. So let's review some of the highlights of yesterday. I was taking a lot of notes yesterday, and some of them not so great as others because there was such great conversations and it was happening so rapid fire. But I'll read a few thoughts. So on the one hand, we're steadily moving from a static and sedentary stage to an ecosystem that's portable and highly mobile. And I'm quoting a lot of the comments made by the presenters. However, all the data being collected is still in silos, and that's the problem. We're going to discuss a little bit about that today. We heard that historical data, that if it's never used or if it's never paired with real-time data, then you never have that engine that drives predictive or presumptive analytics, and that's what it's all about. It's not how much data you have. It's not about forecasting. It's making use of that data in a presumptive fashion. When is that airline engine going to fail? When do you have to do the repairs on it before something happens? Things like that. Many end users are taking that leap of faith, and they're getting their feet wet in at least one IoT project. I was at an event a little while ago, and they said you should be at least tinkering with IoT. And that project may deliver a minimum viable product. I thought that was a great point made yesterday. And this product would have a positive outcome and a measurable ROI, hopefully. However, others are still worried how they can catch up in a risk-averse environment, when I think one of the attendees mentioned that yesterday, where everybody is waiting for someone else to take that first step. There's a lot of trepidation out there. IoT is here. It's disrupting the operational status quo of a lot of companies, yet security is often an afterthought. Someone mentioned that as well. And integration with different data types and systems and scalability are still seen as major issues. Clearly, these are the best of times or potentially the worst of times for IoT, although the same can be said for any game-changing technology. And of course, this is a variation of a passage of one of my wife's favorite books, Tale of Two Cities, although today, if Dickens were alive today, it would be called A Tale of Two Smart Cities, perhaps, I don't know. So this morning we're going to explore some of the issues, the challenges, the opportunities related to IoT, all seen through the experienced lens of the people on my panel, and I've asked them to come up on the stage right now. So we have Dan Baldree, who's the head of business relationship management at the County of Santa Clara's IT department, and the person who has spearheaded a lot of innovation projects there. So welcome, Dan.
Thank
you. Caraway, the IoT community practice leader at MITRE, who is an expert at infrastructure architecture, security, and governance, just to name a few areas. And Vivek Sakhrani, the global director at CPCS Transcom, which is a mouthful, but it's an infrastructure development company whose portfolio includes railways, urban transit, electric power, and a range of other industries. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to sit down because podium's enough about me, so I'll sit down. So I'd like to start by giving each of the panelists a few minutes just to tell us a little bit about what they're involved in as it relates to IoT, and then we'll get right into some of the challenges and issues. And again, if you don't start commenting, I'm going to come down there, I'm going to start shaking a few people. So we'll start with Vivek. Go ahead.
Thanks, Tim. Pleasure to be here and meet all of you. I think the conversation yesterday was quite valuable in setting the stage. My name is Vivek Sue Khurana. I lead the infrastructure analytics practice. By infrastructure here, I should clarify that I mean civil infrastructure projects, transportation, power, and related public-private partnerships. We're a management consulting firm, so we work with clients to help them make decisions. And more often than not, the one main question that our teams are brought in to answer is, how do we enable the public sector evaluate and make better systematic outcomes for the systems that they're dealing with? So I think transportation is a good example and one that we can use to convene the conversation here today. In many ways, the transportation sector is the most visible battleground for some of our conversations. It's because the multiple stakeholders that are involved in the transportation system can see where money is being spent. They use the system actively, and they have an intuitive understanding of how it works. That might not be the case with power or with transport or telecom, where a lot of the actions and the events are driven behind the scenes. So some of these battles, as we talked about yesterday, are shaking out. In other cases, they may not be as extreme as battles, just maybe tussles in which technology might dominate in a particular space, which protocols might evolve, and we're exposed to all of these globally. But of course, as we've talked, a lot of the action is here in North America. I'm happy to talk about that.
All right, thank you, Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Caraway, and I'm with the MITRE Corporation, and I am an IoT practice lead within our organization. Basically, MITRE is a not-for-profit federally funded research center that basically assists the federal government, mostly federal government, some local and state recently, and also international, in systems engineering and IT strategy. From an IoT perspective, we are working with a lot of federal agencies on rolling out strategies. Homeland Security was mentioned yesterday, is probably one of the most active, publicized agencies that's working on IoT. We also ran an IoT challenge last year for unique identification of devices. So basically, we put up a little bit of funding for startup companies, or really any company, to come in and try to find rogue devices. So change the identity of the devices and see who could identify all the devices. Nobody fully identified devices. We had somebody that was about 70%. People initially said, this is really easy, and then came in, and as we changed the identities of the devices, they realized that it was a lot more difficult than it originally was. So we do things around what the government is looking for, or where we need to take the government. In the past, you would see the government 10 years behind. Today, you're seeing the government in IoT really not an emergent, but a few years behind with some leaders out there. We also work on running some IoT symposiums that bring together industry, academia, and government to discuss challenges with implementation. That is being merged into an emerging technology forum this year. So we're pretty proactive. We're trying to lead research and at the same time build capability within our organization to help the federal government. We're working with, I can mention a few things generically, Singapore and a large state to help define smart state and smart cities within that state to determine what we would be rolling out first for them. And I must note that we don't buy or sell any products, so we have the capability of taking something through a prototype and then it gets tech transferred to the government, academia, or commercial entity.
All right, thank you, Karen. Dan?
So my name's Dan Baldree with the County of Santa Clara, and as much as it may feel like its own country, like it has on the slide there, we really are just a county. And so, but we encompass most of Silicon Valley. So when you think of Silicon Valley, Google, all that stuff, we're where they live. And so our county is very focused on really two aspects of this. One, enabling these commercial enterprises to go be successful, because obviously that's tax revenue, that's property tax revenue. We are very excited about that. But there's a huge amount of concern, particularly from longtime residents in our county, about the privacy and security impacts of this. So the comments yesterday are well taken. It's a huge issue for us. Our county has implemented a lot of policies and regulations associated with this. So today, if the county were to implement some system that tracked you by your smell, we have a policy that covers that, right? Everything we do that could be construed as some sort of method of surveillance, which is most of these IoT devices end up falling into that category, right? They can track you and know things. So we're very clear about being open about how we're using this technology and what the implications are for your personal privacy. So for us, that's a big aspect of that. In terms of the work that I do, I work in what we call the business relationship management function in our county. We work closely with departments. The county is really a conglomeration of multiple business lines. We do all kinds of stuff, so much I can't even tell you right now. But what we really focus on is helping make sure that their investments in IT technology and systems are actually getting value. So the taxpayer money that we're putting to use is actually being done with a purpose. So lots more details. We can get into anything you want there, but that's really what my focus is. Happy to be here.
All right, great to have everyone here. And before I get started, Vivek mentioned transportation, so I'm going to throw out a bonus question here. You don't have to answer right away, but toward the end of the session, you can volunteer and see who has the correct answer. So I'm looking for the name of a traffic monitoring device that was invented and put into play probably about 30, 40 years ago. It could have been one of the first IoT devices in existence. It was made by a very famous person, so if you give me the name of the device and that person, not right now, but think about it, and then I'll ask for hands at the end of the, just before the end of the session. So Dan told me just now, he said, I usually send all the questions out to everybody so no one is unprepared, and then I never stick to the questions. And he said, oh, this is going to be like a softball session. So, Dan, I'll start with you. If you were
I like it.
If you were a tree, no. So one of the biggest challenges in IoT right now is dealing with a massive amount of information. We have no problem collecting the data. We have devices out there. Someone said yesterday that the technology is the easy part. We can collect the data. But the problem is we have too much data. I was at a conference in Barcelona last week, and someone referred to it as it's the holy grail of IoT, what to do with that data. Whoever discovers the best use of that is going to be moving up to the top, so to speak. But then there are other people. There's the CIO of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who refers to as, this is dark data. This is data we collect. We're collecting data that relates to the Mars landing, the planned Mars landing. So much data, we're going to throw it away. And then, and if that happens, you won't have the historical data to put together with real-time data, which is a problem. So how significant is this? We talked earlier at breakfast about collecting data, but how significant is this massive growing tsunami of data out there? Dan, go ahead.
So from the county's perspective, we obviously have a lot of data. And so for us, it's not a question of storage, it is a question of the usage. And the struggle that we have primarily today is that the business leaders in most local government agencies don't even know the questions they want to ask. They're so focused on being reactive to current political issues and that sort of thing, that those deeper thoughts about, well, what do we want to be able to do and accomplish with this data is not necessarily something that they're focused on. So our approach to that kind of takes a couple of different forms. One of those, in terms of the work that we do, is working with them on their strategic planning so that we can help them get to that place. And also just hackathons, other types of events where that data is made public, which has its own risks. But our neighbor to the north, Alameda County, which includes Oakland, currently regularly hosts hackathons where they're using public data that they produce in order to feed various initiatives. They'll competitions, contests, cash prizes, all of that. So a lot of what we're doing to deal with that and address the growth of that data is to be working with people where that's primarily their job. Right? That's something they're focused on, and help them be able to utilize the data that we have, which ultimately is a public resource that we're the custodians of.
So usually real live data in these hackathons and seeing what they can do with it, how they make use of it, and things like that.
Right.
Are you trying to build like a simulation model for this thing? Because I know machine learning, a lot of companies there, because there are really no rules, they're making rules as they go along. They're simulating, using simulated data in environments and areas to help the machine learn as they go along. So why use real data? I mean, couldn't you do something else?
So in this case, the real data represents real value. So from the perspective of this, in terms of the MVP, point that came up yesterday, it's really about producing something that's actually useful and ideally immediately. And so in those cases, whether it's restaurant inspection data, I mean, it's not necessarily real-time data, but it is real. So it's maybe census information, information that we track in terms of voting participation, those things which are available, right? There's not really risk in sharing it, but the value of using real data is that you actually are able to have real value returned out of it rather than theoretical value.
So it's more relevant to people as you.
Exactly.
We can make buses schedules and make them move more smoothly and all that.
Right. I'm in front of a restaurant and I want to know, hey, is it safe to eat here? Right. I mean, those are the kind of basic things that end up having a lot of value for the average person in our county.
So New York will do away with those letters in the window, A, B, C, and D, and stay away from C and D.
Oh yeah, we've got red, green, and yellow.
Green, I thought that was the marijuana. No, that's
oh well, that's next.
That's a wholly different conversation. So Vivek, you deal with a lot of different industries, railways, transportation. Massive amounts of data again, but it's logistics problems as well. So is it a whole new ballgame when you're looking at it that way?
I think it's been a persistent challenge over the decades. And often the question that we have to confront is where do the data reside, and are they owned in the right jurisdictions, and are they shared across those walls? So for example, if a city is trying to address the issue of urban congestion, which most cities globally are, and they are thinking of their own transit systems, they may have access to some of that data. But if it's needing to reach across some of those walls to private operators, delivery trucks, vehicles, passengers like you and me, some of the data aren't available, and aren't available in either formats or in resolution that's useful to a planning or an operator in the city to make that decision. And I think that analogy plays out in a number of domains.
So it's proprietary data, those proprietary walls that are built there. It's not necessarily they want to protect the IP, it's just that it just doesn't sync up with other data. It's just not compatible. Yes,
so it's proprietary in nature, but it's also some of our institutional frameworks for how we think of data and how we make use of it. So to get at the value question that Dan mentioned, being able to use the right data sets for addressing the right public issues, often the issue of value depends on the perspective of the end user and the stakeholder there.
Right, and Karen, we had a discussion earlier this morning. You deal with a lot of government agencies. You're kind of up to speed on what regulations might be pending that relate to data and privacy, so maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
So from a government perspective, they want to make the data available as much as possible, but at the same time, they're looking at the privacy and security of that data. And when we say the privacy of the data, we're saying the aggregation of those data sets across disparate data sets, both from the government and others, that would release PII or information that would cause harm to the U.S. or our government. So as far as regulations, they're looking at more of not highly regulating at this point, but monitoring and being able to identify the potential threats. They're also wondering, as data is being aggregated, what is the risk of that data? Who owns the data? And after it's aggregated and there's a threat, or what are the ramifications of the ownership of that data? Who's responsible for that data after it's aggregated, because it's released for one purpose, and then if you get multiple data sets together, could cause harm. So who is ultimately responsible for that? So I don't see that they're regulating right now, but in the future, you may see higher regulation. Obviously, we kind of not tend to be very proactive in saying if something happens, we always are reactatory after an event happens. And right now, there's monitoring and they're trying not to over-regulate, but I foresee probably after the first couple, threats or risks occur that there may be some regulation. But at this point in time, they're trying to not over-regulate anything along the IoT's perspective.
And there's this perception out there that the government is 3 steps behind in terms of regulation, probably propagated by ex-journalists like myself, because it sounds like a great story. Or maybe Al Gore when he invented the internet, I don't know. Is that the case? Is the government really, they're on the ball, and maybe the regulations aren't there yet, as you said, but they're ready to plug something in if something happens?
I think, as we look at traditional IT, perhaps, they were maybe 10 years behind with technology rollout. With IoT, they're really, I wouldn't say the leader, they're not bleeding edge, but they're definitely probably a year or 2 behind. There are some agencies that perhaps have not addressed IoT, but for the most part, they're looking at IoT from a mission perspective and how they can improve some of their missions.
Yeah, and it has to do with the environment, the culture, what's happening now. I know, Dan, from a city or county perspective, it's a different world than it was 5 or 10 years ago, and there's a new immediacy in terms of implementing this stuff. And is security getting pushed back a little bit in favor of maybe making maybe people safer, or things making more convenient?
I would say that definitely in terms of that balance, today the balance falls on the security side, right? And the recent breaches, all of that stuff only kind of reinforces that aspect. And that's actually something that I struggle with, in my role, is finding that balance between the security concerns and the need to protect, basically public data, particularly HIPAA data, PII data, with being able to use that and provide service and things that the public can use. So, but today, in terms of the question, it's really focuses today is on security.
Right, and probably for the immediate future anyway,
yeah.
That's going to be the case. Let's talk a little bit about the tools. We talked about the enormous tsunami of data, and it's increasing every day. Are the tools adequate enough right now to sift through that data? Not the collection tools, but the tools to make sense of all that data? Or do we need really a whole new set of tools to do this? Are we behind in the tool aspect? And Vivek, you can start with your comments.
In our experience, I think a lot of the tools exist. I think the point was well made yesterday by Eric Simone that in many ways we've been making advances in this space for decades on the instrumentation side, on storage, on being able to communicate these data either on closed networks or open networks. And then I think when it comes to the analytics and analysis, there's a lot of deep maturity. So from our experience, it's less so much a question of developing new tools. It's knowing the right tool for the job. So it's the other way to think about this is if you do decide to pick up the hammer, you should know how to use it. So what we're very aware about is making sure that we don't provide the wrong insight with all the right intentions and good use of tools.
Okay, and if anybody has a question related to anything we're talking about, please raise your hand. And I thought Eric did a great job yesterday. He should have his own talk show. He's terrific. What about, so IoT projects, we talked about minimum value products and targeting that, getting quick successes, to motivate or just show that these things work rather than trying to get, the big success out of the gate. What do you think are some of the roadblocks in terms of smaller companies, or even really small companies getting started in IoT. I know one of the things that came up at the Barcelona show that relates to agri-tech is financing it. If you're a farmer and your concern is just planting the crops and hopefully it's not going to rain or will rain enough, and if you have a bad season, you're dead. And I talked with some farmers at this show who said, I have a barn full of drones. I don't have the time to learn how to use these things. I know it would be great if I could, but I've got a field to till and all that stuff. And then there's the funding aspect. We mentioned blockchain technology yesterday. And in Europe, they're actually using blockchain to arrange financing so small farms could get into IoT so they can afford to do this stuff. They don't want an us versus them or a have and have not situation in terms of this technology when major companies can do it and smaller companies can't. But what are some of the roadblocks you see to getting projects? Everyone has to do something, but what are some of the challenges in doing that?
So I can speak to that in our case. And I've worked for large and small counties, and it's easier for smaller companies, in my opinion, right? They're just more nimble. There's just less barriers, less red tape, lots of things. Let them quickly respond to this stuff. In our case, a lot of the issues for us getting into those projects is being able to navigate the bureaucracy associated with getting there, as well as dealing with some of the legacy products and systems that are currently in place, right? We have, I don't know how many different, we have multiple fueling systems, we have multiple environmental control systems. Getting all those things to work together, having effective standards that work in terms of our capital funding process and our project methods, that's a real challenge for us. And smaller companies just don't have to deal with that to the same extent that we do. So I think the opportunities are there, but it is definitely, I think, harder in the government space, and maybe that extends up to the federal side too. The bigger we are, the harder it is to be able to do these things in a concerted fashion in order to kind of gather everything you need together in order to deliver outcomes and results.
But hackathons seem to be a way to get people involved throughout the company and even outside the organization or the city or the government.
That's some of those kind of back alleys and shortcuts to kind of get to outcomes that we wouldn't have a much harder time selling internally in terms of using staff resources to be able to do some of those things.
Karen, you can talk about that because you had the hackathon you mentioned earlier.
Sure. I think there's lots of opportunities out there for smaller companies as long as they're aware that they're publicized. There's a lot of federal government from a federal perspective. There's a lot of funding available for quick research, quick challenges. Homeland Security has challenges available all the time. They're targeting the small businesses. They're really not targeting the large businesses, although they'll talk to everybody. So they're trying to make these challenges available. We offer maybe 3 a year. We're not in a position where we can, fund a lot. We give maybe $50,000, for the research that they're doing. But I think there are challenges from a smaller business perspective where they really need to work with larger organizations, especially in IoT. You're not starting out by yourself. If you are, you're not going to succeed. You need to partner. You need to leverage other people. But the funding is available for the smaller businesses, more so than there is larger businesses. From a government perspective, larger government perspective, it's I think the bureaucracy is definitely there. The processes take a lot longer to get anything approved. Something in a commercial where you could roll out in a year may take 2 or 3 years just to get through an acquisition. If you're with a more progressive agency and they have streamlined some of their acquisitions, they can turn things around in 6 or 8 weeks or 12 weeks. But that's the exception. That's not the norm. Typically, we're still dealing with the longer acquisition cycles, very stringent paperwork to get through for implementation. So one would say that a smaller business probably could break through the bureaucracy a lot quicker.
Or a new structure in IT organization. I think a lot of, say, in the area of innovation, a lot of the innovation activities were initially driven by business, but now they're being overseen by IT and really going up to the next level. So is it a question of giving the IT organization more leeway to do these projects without the bureaucracy and the business restrictions?
I think that's a double-edged sword. I think IT sometimes tries to drive things forward too too much, and you may not meet the business requirements by doing such. So you can give leeway to the IT, but ultimately I think the business needs to be involved and needs to have approval. Otherwise, you're going to get a product that is 100% IT-centric with no business functionality, and there's going to be a lot more waste of funding there.
Okay, even if it's a pilot project?
Yeah,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Does anybody agree with that? Anybody disagree with that? That, IT should scale back a bit and let business drive this, first of all? Right there?
I agree with that. I'm from accounting too, so Dean and I from accounting have many leaders. So there's a county, probably executive, then there's elected officials. And having this smart counties is more difficult. That's why I think you've seen it in the smart cities faster, because the mayor oversees the entire organization, and just getting the data. This is analogous to criminal justice data, trying to get it out of the county clerk, the district clerk, the jail. Getting data out of these organizations is very difficult, so I'm hoping Dan would agree with that. And then
Can be.
now to do this Internet of Things where people don't know where that data is going, just compounds these folks, not wanting to let out their information.
But I think that comes back to the point. It still needs to be business driven. I mean, IT can definitely support that, and we're going through a restructuring right now that's all about that. Working, basically placing IT close with the business, particularly for business-centric things, whether it's core business processes, where essentially we are part of the management team for that department to help them see the possibilities, help them ask the right questions. But at the end of the day, in terms of this going before the board for a funding request or someone, it needs to be the executive, the chief executive within that department who is making the case for it.
But you're kind of a hybrid, though, because you've developed a business relationship management team, you've embedded IT within the business, which a lot of companies are doing. So that's sort of different than just saying, hey, let business make that decision, and IT will support whatever you do.
I completely agree with that. For us, it's a partnership, right? I mean, it's a partnership with the business to help them see the possibilities. That's, for me, what it really boils down to. We're their partners in them being successful.
If they can see the win for them, it's much easier for IT just to do the methodical work. But you need that sponsorship at the highest level you can.
Exactly.
It has to be a county initiative, I think.
Yeah, it has to have to have that support from the top. Yeah.
Everyone then aligns to that.
All right.
Yep.
What about the private sector?
So I think there's a fundamental connection here between all the points that are being made. And so when you say a business decision driving some of these requirements, I interpret that as making a case for the public value of ultimately what are these systems and processes going to deliver. And I find that disconnected often from the procurement approach, which tends to emphasize, not always, but often tends to emphasize least cost procurement. And that makes it very difficult to make the value argument. I think value, the idea and concept of value needs to be expanded a little bit more. The dimensions to value can be supplemented in a way that works for industry and the private sector, as well as for the public interest.
Okay, let's talk about projects now. I mentioned getting that pilot project started. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about some projects that you may have been involved in that maybe didn't pan out as well, or maybe you had to change trajectories a bit. I mean, we're all about the wins yesterday. This is, the technology works. This is great. This is good stuff. There are going to be some problems and challenges and errors along the way. I don't want you to, open the Pandora's box, so to speak, but there must be something you did that said, maybe I should have done that.
I'm trying to think of a kind of an IoT-specific example. I can think of multiples that are not necessarily IoT-specific.
You mean about the tie? No, I'm not kidding. No, that was, I was only kidding.
Yeah. From an IoT specific, man, how do you think about that? I mean, so part of our, I don't know that it's necessarily individual project failure, but it's a failure of the system in terms of standardization and getting systems that can interoperate. So I mentioned kind of the multiple fueling systems and multiple environmental control systems. And we have those problems today because of the processes, and the bureaucracy as it's set up today does emphasize low cost, as kind of part of a bid package where these, contractors and other people make bids. And we're not publishing the standards and interfaces that they need to comply with in order to deliver a solution. The facilities aspect in particular is kind of lives over there, kind of that OT space, right? The IT engagement when it comes to setting standards and figuring out how some of those things will interconnect hasn't been there in the past. And so we're dealing with the effects of that today as we strive to take more of those building and IoT type systems, OT systems that are out there, and knit them together into something that can answer business questions and address the issues that the county is currently facing. So I would say that represents a failure of imagination and vision in the past as far as, well, what's possible with these systems. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to address that today, but I think that is an example of a failure on the county's part to be prepared for the future.
All right, and Karen, you deal with a lot of different companies and agencies, and has something happened where they say they didn't quite get what I'm trying to tell them to do, and maybe they tried something that didn't quite go the way it should have?
Well, unfortunately,
we don't have to name names, but
no, unfortunately, we're in an R&D environment, so everything we do internally is an experiment. For our customers, a lot of times we don't see everything through implementation. We give a lot of strategy, and they don't always implement or proceed forward with that, or it may take 3 or 4 years for them to implement. So at that point, it's past the technology curve, and they need to, in some cases, start over. So giving specific examples about implementation would be a little bit more difficult in IoT, being that Homeland Security is probably the leader, and they have integrators that are doing the implementation for them.
So I want to bring our attention back to a comment I think made yesterday by Eric Fleming from Arizona Public Service, and I think what I took away was that when you are already at the frontier of the industry, you don't really have, you've already maxed out the benchmarking possibilities there. So you're in this state of experimentation, and experimentation to me doesn't quite mean automatic failure. It means a variance of outcomes.
Right.
So looking at any one project, it could be misleading. So I think there's definitely lessons to be learned across the entire distribution of outcomes, which means looking at a large set of projects and looking at what the particular circumstances for success or failure were.
Yeah, and you shouldn't be afraid of failing, because it's going to happen, and you'll learn by the failure going forward. Yeah. Is Eric in the audience today? There he is. Yeah, you should be up here too. I borrowed your comment as well. You were very collaborative. Go ahead.
It's on? Okay. We're discussing a lot about the future in terms of project success, technology rollouts, regulatory. At how much and to what degree would you attribute either growth rate of this technology, use and utilization of the technology? At what point do you attribute the political side? And what I mean by that is, in many organizations, the IT organization has different KPIs, metrics, and targets, as well as priorities than the business. Additionally, they tend to have different cultures. And so their understanding and the approach to sensor technology, not only use of data, but what is success and where they're hitting their metrics. To what degree do both cultures or metrics inhibit or help accelerate the use of the technology, the deployment of the technology, and the use and the utilization of data?
Good question. Yeah. Go ahead. You're nodding your head, so take off.
Well, I think a lot of this ends up boiling down to the measurement of what kinds of outcomes you're able to measure and track to. And measurement is fundamentally a political problem, because you can measure things in all kinds of ways. And if I can measure the outcomes to demonstrate success in a direction that carries all the vested interests forward, I'm happy to be a champion of the technology, share that data, make it available. And if what I have is counteracting to that, it might not be in my best interest. So I might intentionally decelerate my adoption of something. So I think, not to cast too negative a light on it, but I think what's fundamental there is that there is a political economy to the systems that we're working in when it comes to the absorption of this technology, right? And so connecting those decisions with what outcomes are available to be seen and scrutinized could make a big difference.
Any further comments?
In terms of the political implications, I think the way it works within our county is, there's various interests, and on the political side, both for the elected officials, they need victories that they can tell the public, you elected me and I have produced this. right? At the department level, the leadership there wants to be able to say that we are delivering value, service to the constituencies that use our product, whether it's a park, whether it's the clerk recorder's office, whatever it is. So to the extent that these technologies are used in ways that help them achieve those goals, basically looking good, if we take it down to the net result, they're going to be successful, right? If you can produce something where they can say, that's going to make me look good, it makes it a lot easier to put these things in, as opposed to being able to say, well, it improves efficacy in this one little area.
Okay, great. One of the terms that's bandied about a lot today is digital disruption. Everything's a disruptor, and you have to disrupt a business to bring it to the next level. If you look at companies like Amazon, disrupting that industry, Netflix certainly disrupting the entertainment industry and the way people view movies. We all stream now. We didn't do it 6 months ago. What's the digital disruptor for IoT? It can't be IoT. That's just the channel. It has to. What's going to happen in IoT that's going to be that aha digital disruptor? Is it something like machine learning? Is it something that has to be sort of on the UI or the front end and the edge intelligence? What do you see as being that digital disruptor? Karen. Gotcha.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know that I definitely have the answer to that.
We're keeping score, Karen.
I understand. So I think it's going to have to be something that basically affects the citizens or the end user, that makes something extremely easy.
But is it a technology? Is it a new language? Is it a procedure?
I would say it's going to be a process that's implemented through technology, probably something on the transportation, faster transportation.
But what's going to make that happen?
but-
What's that aha thing? Because I mentioned PCs earlier, and no one would have purchased the IBM PC if it didn't have a spreadsheet on it, because it's a spreadsheet machine for business that got into the enterprise. That was the next level move. So what's going to happen here? You can't say it's going to make life easier, because you all hope it's going to make life easier, but what's the element that's going to make that happen? And I'll take you off the spot. We'll turn to Dan now. What do you see?
Well, I'll just, up front, people aren't really interested in the government disrupting itself, first of all.
Oh, you're funny.
And so while in industry,
Why do you say that, Dan?
I'm just saying, in industry, right, there certainly may be things that disadvantage certain companies and put them out of business because something newer and better has come along. But in terms of the work that we do, things tend to be incremental. And in many cases, we are not able to stop doing the old thing. I was visiting my grandma over the weekend, right? Paying things online. I mean, she still wants to write a check, right? So we live in a world where we have to be able to support the people who want to come in and count out change, as well as the people who want to be able to do it from their smartphone. So in a lot of cases, we're not some of these things just represent added convenience, but don't necessarily add up to governmental efficiency because we can't stop doing the old way. And so that is a real challenge for us in being able to serve all of the various constituencies that we're required to serve. So some of these things just end up being more expensive and don't necessarily save anything. So the value is really the added capability, the service for these different constituencies, and not necessarily the saving money. So we're really not disrupting things in that way, because we're going to keep doing the old thing until...
I think you're not using the term disruption, but in a way you are. I mean, smart counties, smart cities, it's sort of disrupting the status quo of people's everyday life. So you don't have to use the term, because that could be kind of unsettling, but I think you're absolutely, no one wants to say that government is disrupting their lives.
Right.
Vivek, any
So
comments?
when you ask about disruption, I think two things come to mind. One is the actual content, so the technology or the process that might lead to some kind of change, and then of course there's a timing question. So I think on the first part of it, on technology or processes, from a dinner conversation last night, further commoditization of sensors, I think is really changing how we do things. Being able to use computer vision in a distributed manner, inclusive of the edge computing effects, being able to deploy some of these cameras on traffic cabinets on signals, and be able to process flows in real time to understand what's a truck, what's a fire truck from a FedEx truck or a bicycle and be able to pass some of those metrics back to a control center. We're starting to see some examples of that. On the timing, I'm a little bit more of a skeptic with the idea that this is going to happen overnight. I think a lot of what we've observed is very intentional, incremental progress in a number of technology fields that often converge. And that's
Okay.
what leads to some kind of change.
So is that technology disruptor maybe intelligence at the edge of all these cameras of things happening there, and instead of feeding a lot of data back, of feeding intelligence back?
Well, I think it's just being again, trying to bring this conversation back to where we started. It's now having that massive data source and being able to link it back to what to do with it once you have it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's closing some of those feedback loops.
Okay, and I think we're just about out of time, so I have like 19 billion more questions. But I know everyone's on the edge of their seats wondering what the answer to the question is that I posed earlier. Does anybody know what that early monitoring device is and who invented it 30, 40 years ago or longer? No one? And the prize was you'd get the a language translation made easy, the Dorchester edition. So Phil said he has multiple copies in his library. He'd more than be happy to give that to the winner. So the name of the device is the trafficometer, and it's that little box with the little cord that goes across the expressway and just measures the wheels as it goes over. And it was invented by anybody? Bill Gates, when he was 13 years old. And he sold the technology to the county or the city where he lived. His father helped him develop it. And that was the start of everything, that little cord. That's it. Yeah, billions. Yeah, and look at him now. Smart ass little 13-year-old. That's it. I want to thank my panelists. I hope this was very informative for everybody. Thank you to the audience. Thanks, Phil, for the opportunity.